Trail and Ultrarunners, what is going on? What's happening? Welcome to another episode of the Koopcast. As always, I'm your host, Coach Jason Koop, and on this episode of the podcast, we have a real treat for you runners out there. On the podcast today, I have the incomparable Stephen Seiler, PhD, otherwise known as the godfather of Polarized Training. If you've been paying attention to the endurance world over the last several years, you've surely come across this notion of polarized training, or it's sometimes referred to as 80-20 training. Polarized training is a concept popularized by Stephen, where training should be designed such that 80% of it is in the low intensity domain, something ultrarunners are quite good at, and 20% of it is in the high intensity domain. And we see this training distribution play out in elite athletes and recreational athletes alike. Steve has been on countless podcasts and has given, I can't tell you how many presentations on this topic, as well as the topic of what intervals are quote unquote best for endurance athletes. So much so that I wanted to use this time with Steve and zoom out a little bit for this conversation. Instead of getting into the minutia of if 45-second intervals are better than 3-minute intervals, or if 1-minute intervals are better than 8-minute intervals, Steve and I discussed the practical, big picture application of it all. And it was an honor to have this conversation with Steve, as I have respected him for many years and used countless amounts of his research in my book, as well as in my coaching practice. And he has influenced many, many others in the exact same way. So here it is. Let's get right into it. Here's my conversation with Stephen Seiler. Brings us up a really good launch point to start out with. I mean, athletes are obsessed with what is going to give me the best bang for the buck. Like, what is the singular workout structure or singular architecture that I can do to make the most out of my time? And we see this at the elite level because they're looking to maximize the last few percent of performance. But we also see this at the recreational level as well, because they're limited by time predominantly. They've got work, they've got kids, other roles that they play in life and things like that. And I feel like a lot of the research that you've self-professed to be bored with that's come out over the last several years has started to hone in on some, I'm not going to say the answer, but some plausible combinations of things that could be better than others when we look at the entire scope of endurance training.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've given a lecture I've called it as a tribute to Maslow, a kind of a hierarchy of endurance training needs. And it kind of flips on the head this popularity contest that you're referring to. And that is the single best predictor of performance is just training time.
Yeah.
Up through a pretty big number of kilometers or hours per week. So there is no getting around that. There is no shortcut to, if you want to be a really good marathoner or ultra runner or rower or whatever, you got to do the work. And 5 hours a week is better than 3. And 8 hours a week is better than 5, but not as much better. It's not as much of an additional improvement as the jump from 3 to 5. And so you do have this law of diminishing returns, no doubt about it. And so most people find themselves on a place on that curve where more is still better. Whereas way out at the elite level, they're at a place on that curve where that's a very touch and go proposition of whether more will actually be better or will push them over the cliff. So, but for most of us, more is better if we can, do it manageably without getting bonked on the head by our partner or whoever, so that is still, so what I tend to say is more is better, but then in that volume of, getting stuff done, doing the work, then you need to find some appropriate distribution. And then we start talking about intensity zones, right? And so all the evidence that I am able to find and see is that most of that work should be at a fairly moderate intensity, meaning below first lactate turn point, which is that's That's the home field advantage for the Ultrarunners. They do a lot of that already. But even the elite the elite distance runners, the 5K specialists, the rowers who race for 6 minutes, it's still true for them as well, that most of their training is at sub-threshold intensity. So we have found that this is a very robust recipe that is not very specific to competition distance or duration, I guess is the duration is what matters. So from at least 4 minutes, 5 minutes up to 5 hours, pro cyclists, 6 hours, this basically the same distribution as what we see. The only thing that changes is just what are the key workouts? Like, how do you use the hard sessions? How do you distribute those? If you're a marathon type doing a prep, those hard sessions may look more like threshold work. If you're a 3,000 meter runner, then they're going to be more like VO2 max intervals. So that kind of thing, but hard, easy, 80-20, those kinds of concepts fundamentally seem to apply across that entire duration spectrum. So now then the question would be for your audience, okay, but when you talk 6 hours, you're just getting to the starting line now, because that's where that's upper end of my world in terms of high performance endurance sport, 6 hour stages in cycling, right?
Right.
Or I guess you can go out to Ironman triathletes and they're doing 8 hours, 8.5 in that range. And that's the spectrum that's within that range that's relevant to world championships, Olympics, and all this stuff. And then you guys begin.
And then we begin. So
Right.
we're gonna get into some of what that intensity distribution looks like and what that intensity should actually look like. But I think before that, just to set the table for the audience a little bit, I think we need to walk through a little bit how we can define intensity across the entire spectrum of we'll leave it into the endurance realm, because once we get more intense than the typical endurance realm, it starts to get even more complicated than that.
Right.
But every single year that I've been coaching, and I'm going into my 20 some odd year, 21st or 22nd year of coaching, it seems like we've added an intensity range. When I first started out, there were 3 intensity ranges, and then there were 5, and then there were 7, and then there were 9, and then there were 13, and on and on and on. And I can't keep track of them anymore. And whenever I come back to high performance physiologists, I always ask them, I'm like, is this practical? Is having this many divisions of an aerobic intensity really all that different?
It's just silly. I mean, silly is the kindest word I can find for it. I got to be honest with you, and so you cannot. I would challenge any physiologist with any letters behind their name to tell me how in the hell they're dividing that cake up into 8 or 10 or 12 slices or 13 in terms of distinguishable, reproducible, physiological changes that distinguish zone 7 from 8, from 10, from 12. Forget about it. I mean, if I was Italian, that's what I'd be saying. Forget about it. The best I'm able to do physiologically, and if you go to the research literature, well, and that the thing is, I know that the people you're talking about with these 12, they're not the ones that are publishing, because that's just not getting published. You don't ever see in the research literature 12 training zones.
Right. You see it in practice.
Right.
You see it with coaching and with athletes, for sure.
Right. So let's be clear and with credit to my research colleagues, they're not doing that stuff. Generally, in the research literature, you will very often see only 3 aerobic zones, meaning between the lowest intensity you would use in training and maximum oxygen consumption in that range, which covers let's say from 50% of VO2 max to 100% of VO2 max. Generally, that cake gets cut into 3 zones. And the reason that's true is because the distinguishable physiological changes that we're able to identify consistently is this so-called first lactate turn point and second lactate turn point. And those also can be identified as pretty much the same points using ventilation measurements, so-called ventilatory threshold measurements. So then you've got LT1, LT2, and VO2 max as your three typical lab anchors, right? Now there's some wiggle room on defining LT1 and LT2, but it's not as big an issue as Republicans versus Democrats, to put it that way. It's much narrower. Okay.
And so some athletes will be familiar with just a standard incremental exercise test and having those tests done on them. But for an athlete out in the field that's trying to figure out where those physiological anchors will be for them, the first lactate turn point, the second lactate turn point, practically, how can they internalize that?
Yeah, the first one I would say is a pretty decent surrogate or proxy is just the talk test. If you, and I'll even make it, I'll give it a double test. One is you should be able to talk while at that, say sentences. I'm not saying talk for 2 hours. I'm saying, but you should be able to speak 3 or 4 sentences comfortably to a person running alongside you and not feel like you're out of breath, because basically the talk test is a proxy for a ventilatory test. We're trying to say, is ventilation under reasonable control? Are they hyperventilating? If they're starting to hyperventilate, then they'll have trouble talking. And ventilation is one of those things that changes when you pass that first threshold. So it's kind of just a poor man's ventilation test to do this talk test. Now, the other proxy that I use a lot is, and I tell people that if you're well ventilated, meaning you're getting airflow and you're drinking, then once you've warmed up and you've been exercising for say 15 to 20 minutes, your core temperature is stabilized, you're in your rhythm, then your heart rate should pretty well stay flat at whatever that heart rate is for the next hour, next at least 45 minutes, meaning that gives you you should have a fairly flat heart rate without what we call decoupling, where that heart rate is just drifting up, up, up. If that's happening, if your heart rate is drifting after 15, 20 minutes, then chances are you're above LT1, okay? I did a workout just 2 days ago, 48 hours ago. I purposefully did an 80-minute threshold session, 82 minutes. And my heart rate, I know my LT1, I know my 60-minute power, and I was on the upper end towards 60-minute power, and heart rate just slowly drifted upward the entire time. And that's what I expected, and it's super reproducible. But when I do low intensity sessions, heart rate stays flat as long as I'm not fatigued from strength training the day before or something. So this is a good surrogate measure, is just looking at that heart rate response. Talk test plus heart rate, flat heart rate, put them together. They give you a pretty good idea, am I in that low intensity zone? If heart rate's drifting up and you're starting to feel like it's not so good to talk, then that's threshold. And then when you're above the second turn point, well, that generally,
not sustainable, super hard.
Right. We're talking minutes instead of an hour. We're you're counting the clock, and time just really slows down once you get above LT2. That's one of the easiest things, is you're looking at the clock. If you're doing a session and you're at that intensity, your head is really struggling to count those seconds because they feel like they're getting stretched.
So to kind of basically summarize this, we've got these 3 ranges. The first one can be categorized as easy, in where ventilation and heart rate is not going to change based on duration as long as you're hydrated and
let me just slow you down there.
Yep.
Eventually it will,
Yeah,
but the rate of change, it's quasi steady state.
Yep.
But I want us to get into that quasiness later, because that quasi aspect is super important if you're an ultra runner.
Yep. So that's the first range. Second zone or range is where things start to get uncomfortable. Heart rate's going to gradually increase, and it's not an intensity that you could sustain for much more than, you mentioned you did an 80-minute session there, but 90 minutes is kind of typically what we would consider the upper limit of what you could sustain in that range. But it's getting uncomfortable. The third zone, the red zone in your color scheme, is something that's extremely uncomfortable. It's only sustainable for minutes, a few minutes, several minutes at the very most, and you're in that range. Ventilation rate is really high, and it continues to increase second after second, minute after minute, and as you mentioned, you are counting the seconds down for which you can stop and cease exercise at that intensity.
You're counting minutes at least. I mean, it depends again where you are. If you're just above that second turn point versus if you're way above. But if you're just above, generally one of the things you'll see is if you get above that second turn point, then eventually your heart rate will get up to max.
Yep. Perfect.
Okay. It'll just keep climbing. So, but that may be, you could see this in a 5K.
Yep.
Right. You would see pretty much heart rate max at the end of a 5K, whereas at the end of a 10K, it'll probably heart rate max, you'll be at maybe 95, 98% of heart rate max. You won't be quite to 100% even by the end of a 10K.
Yep.
So it's subtle, but yeah, I would say it's either you're counting seconds or you're counting minutes, but you're definitely counting.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I think it's also worth pointing out that all three of these ranges, the easy range, which is the green range, the middle range, which is the yellow range, and the red range, which is the harder range or the severe domain, are all aerobic. These are
absolutely.
These are all within an endurance discipline. They are all aerobic intensities. The energy that you're metabolizing, you're doing so through aerobic sources.
Absolutely. This idea of the anaerobic, because some people would call that second turn point the so-called anaerobic threshold. I'm going to call that bullshit. That is just wrong. It's a very poor name because it implies something that's physiologically wrong. It's like the aerobic metabolism stops and something else starts, and that's just wrong.
100% agree with that, and we could go on for another 2 or 3 podcasts on that.
It's all about, in this entire range up to 100%, it's all about oxidation, oxygen. That doesn't mean there's not lactate production. That doesn't mean there's not glycolysis, but it's about driving the motor with oxidation, with oxygen.
Okay, so now we've got this 3-zone intensity framework, and what athletes are very curious about is how can we manipulate intensity and time at intensity to maximize the adaptive response within however we can kind of contrive intervals. You already mentioned earlier that volume is going to be king, essentially, up to a certain point, but that point is really high, even amongst elite athletes. 5 hours is better than 3 hours, and 8 hours is better than 5 hours, as you mentioned earlier. But when we have like an ISO time situation, athlete can only train 12 hours a week for whatever reason.
Right.
They're limited by time, they're limited by injury or whatever. Right. They want to be able to organize the intensity within that 12 hours in the smartest way possible. And predominantly driven by your team out there, we've tried to contrive all of these different interval situations 8 ways from Sunday: 45 seconds on, 15 seconds easy, 1 minute on, one.
No, wait a minute. Who is my team? You're talking to sports sciences. Okay. Yeah, it's just thanks to me, guys like me. Yeah, I hear you. It's a great question what you're asking, and it's a fundamental question that doesn't get asked in the right way because we tend to chop things up into interval training or this, but it's really about the mix. That's what you become a champion with is not the one epic session or the one magic session, but the hundreds of sessions in a year and how they're flowing together. And so, well, 12 hours, that's a pretty nice amount of time to be able to work with. A lot of people would ask me that question if they only had 5 hours, and then it gets even trickier.
Yeah.
But anyway, you go, what I would say, look, what I don't want to do is fall into the trap of letting every session start to look the same, because that is the most likely regression towards the mean you will see, is that person who does have 12 hours a week or 10 hours a week. And let's say they train 5 to 6 times a week, they have one off day, then that's starting to sound like 2 hours a day every day, right? And if I say, well, I've only got 5 or 6, then it's 1 hour a day every day, and that's probably even more typical of 35-year-olds with 3 small kids and a job and all this stuff. And so then that's the first thing I'm going to say is, well, what we're going to try to do is avoid falling into that black hole where every session becomes kind of a, it ends up often being yellow zone.
Right.
Okay. If you've only got an hour, if you've got 2 hours a day, that'll tend to help keep you from being able to do that, but you'll still have a tendency to be doing a lot of work at the same intensity. So that what I'm going to start to do is start to really say, all right, I'm going to try to get you to do, if you're an ultra runner for sure, I'm going to want at least one of those sessions to be ultra long or longer. I'm going to, and I'll pay that account by reducing the duration of another session. So instead of 2 times 2, I'll say, give me a 3 hour plus a 1 hour. Okay. Cause then I'm going to start stretching you in the duration direction on at least one of those weekly sessions, and maybe 2. And then I might try to push you, if you're really preparing for an ultra and you're on 12 hours a week and that's your time budget, then I might try to say, all right, the next step in that progression, I'm going to try to get you to give me either Saturday or Sunday 2 times 2. Where now I'm going to squeeze together 2 workouts. They're not 1 4-hour session yet, but that's 2 hours, lunch, talk with the kids, do some requirement at home, and then go 2 more hours. You with me?
Yeah. So what you're saying is the first step is to take that volume and manipulate kind of the density at which it happens during the week. And in that way, what I just wrote down was 3 + 1 is greater than 2 + 2.
I think so. Yes. And that would be, I would say this for a cyclist. I would say this for a marathoner, not necessarily 3 hours of running for them, but what I'm saying?
Right.
That I'm going to try to stretch, because again, let's go back to our 2 fundamental tools in training is intensity and duration, right? And so we tend to try to use the intensity hammer too much. So it's a very well-known tool. Well, we're comfortable with that tool, and we tend to pound harder when things don't go well. But the other hammer is a subtle one, but it's extension. So one of the things I often say to people is, every time you train, you're asking yourself this question: what do I do? What am I doing today? Am I intensifying or am I extending? Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%.
Is the purpose of this workout to extend my durability, or is it to intensify my aerobic capacity? Because, and ultimately both of those are valuable, but for the ultra runner, the real room for improvement will be on the extensive side more than it will be on the intensification side.
Yeah, and
so I'm going to try to create room for that.
We see a lot of coaches and athletes, they try to peanut butter spread their volume out in this effort of consistency, which that hammer gets, or that drum, I'll use that analogy since you were using the hammer analogy earlier, that drum gets beat a lot, right? You need to be consistent. You need to do a similar thing day after day, and that's what produces champions and blah, blah, blah. But what I'm hearing from you, and I wholeheartedly agree with this, I've written a lot about it, is that after you've maximized your volume or figured out what your maximum volume can be as a byproduct of logistics or training or whatever, after that, finding out a way to distribute that volume in an efficacious and uneven and or lopsided fashion would be the next kind of step in your hierarchy of needs for an ultra runner. Am I encapsulating that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where I think you have to look at the scale of the consistency.
Right. Yep.
Consistency has scales.
Yep.
And so, yeah, I agree that consistency, like this year, because of Corona, I personally traveled less than normal. I usually do. And I was more consistent in my professor training, which means I'm not really training, but I did manage to train 10 hours a week this year. I hit 500 hours, and that was because I was able to be more consistent. But even within that consistency, it ranged from 7 to 14 hours a week, if that makes sense. So it depends on the scale you're looking at. And now within, let's say, if you're using a week as your microcycle, I'm not necessarily sure that's always the best thing to do, but let's say it's 7-day cycles. Yeah, you're going to be roughly consistent in how many hours a week, but you don't want to be consistent at the day-to-day scale.
Right.
Because that's where you get in trouble.
100%. I'm
consistent
100%
at the weekly scale, the monthly scale, but don't try to be consistent at the daily scale, because then you will very likely move yourself into a stagnation kind of equation where you're just putting in the numbers, but you're not actually extending or intensifying to get real progress.
Yeah, and you've brought up this really important concept related to this in a number of different talks that I've seen you in. And by the way, you are everywhere. I do, before I get on.
I don't know if that's a good thing.
I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but I have to mention it because it's coming up right now. In my effort to do a little bit of research with any guests, I go and I see where they've given lectures and podcasts and things like that. I had too many to go through with you that were just within the last quarter, just within the last 3 months. So I don't know how you have time to do it all, but you are absolutely everywhere. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, like I said, this year has been pretty special just because of Corona and working at home and digital everything. So the only thing I can say is the lead time or the time it takes to do, usually if I were to give an hour lecture in Venice, or wherever, there's at least 4 days, 3 to 4 days, right? Travel. But now it's 4 hours.
Yeah. 100%.
And I think that has resulted in more density.
There we go. Density. I love it. I digress. Okay. So one of the things that you have brought up is that a unit of time at a particular intensity is very different depending upon where that unit of time occurs within the exercise. So an hour running at an easy zone 1 pace is way different at the end of a 3-hour activity, a 3-hour run, or even a 2-hour run, as it is 1 hour at the very beginning or doing an hour onto itself. Explain to the listeners why that is so much different and why we need to take that account in training.
Well, and I guess that brings us back to this issue of steady state, because there's this tendency to say, yeah, if I'm at low intensity, I'm in a steady state. My heart rate is flat. My lactate is flat. Well, yes and no. It's true for about an hour, but if you keep going, what happens? It's a war of attrition. Your body is slowly breaking down. You are becoming glycogen depleted. You may be becoming dehydrated depending on how good you are at drinking. Your blood glucose is going down. Your muscles there is literally physical damage due to the eccentric loading. So there's a slow but sure damage resulting, and we can actually measure that with creatine kinase release and things like that. So there's a lot of attrition. There's some damage. There is fatigue. There's energy depletion. All of this is happening as you run, even at low intensity, even at below the first lactate turn point. And as muscles fatigue, as the muscles you're using to run at 12 kilometers an hour, whatever it might be, are fatiguing, then your brain, to maintain that same pace, your brain has to recruit more muscle. It has to start tapping into additional so-called motor units. It's calling in reinforcements, because the efficiency of the muscles that were being recruited that first hour, that efficiency is getting lower. They're becoming less efficient. They're fatiguing. So it costs more oxygen to do the same running speed. So there's a lot of things happening. And one of the things that that whole set, that durability, you can put that all under this term durability. So one of the things that seems to happen with extended training over time is the athlete becomes more durable, meaning that this attrition happens more slowly. They're more efficient. They use glycogen more slowly. They just are able to, that second hour is not as much tougher as it is for the beginner who goes from hour 1 to hour 2, right? I mean, good grief, boy, when I started cycling again, I saw it, I could just see it in the data, how much my heart rate drift decreased. It just stayed flatter longer. And I felt better at the end of the 3-hour ride than I did when I first started to do a 3-hour ride. So this is a durability issue. And this is one of the things, it's, I guess for the ultra runner, it is one of the key adaptations you're trying to achieve over time, is push back, keep pushing back that monkey, that attrition monster that's jumping on your back and just starting to make you feel like this is a really dumb idea. Why am I doing this? Because of the fatigue you feel in every part of your body.
The attrition monster. I love that. I'm going to coin that and give you credit for it. It's so
I just used 2 seconds to make up that term because it's the best I could come up with. But it in the 400 meter, we always used to say the monkey was jumping on your back.
Right.
But here we'll call it the attrition fog or monster, whatever. But it's maybe not quite as heavy, but it does sink in on you.
Yeah, and part of the reason that we have to use these kind of like this clever vocabulary is because it is not described very well in the research literature. We have very good and robust ways of describing power at 4 millimeters of lactate and lactate threshold and speed at VO2 max and things like that. But this durability concept, we keep making references to things like cardiac drift and decoupling, but at the end of the day, we're just taking stuff that has been studied in other areas and extrapolating it to the ultra distance events. And I'm still not convinced that we have good ways of like completely describing what is going on, but the more important thing for the athletes that are listening to it is what to do about it.
Yeah, well, I think you're completely right. And I do think that still ultra running is fairly unexplored territory from a pure sports science physiology standpoint.
It's changing though. It's changing.
Yeah, it's slowly, and of course it makes sense that it is difficult because, good grief, it's hard enough to get people to come into a lab to run for an hour. And so sports science, we struggle with this dilemma of the laboratory need for very strict control versus trying to do things that have external validity and application to out in the field. And good, most of the lab stuff is applicable within about the hour duration range, but then it starts to fall apart.
Yep.
Because that threshold power or pace that you have, it is not what you have after 3 hours.
Yep.
You don't have that anymore. Yep. You don't have that threshold power or pace.
100%.
And you certainly don't have it after 8 hours. Yep. So it's just a new ball game, and all those numbers you collected in the lab after a 15-minute warm up and an incremental protocol, and you were done in an hour. Well, good grief, throw them out the window. They're just not there 12 hours into a 24-hour race or whatever, you know.
Well, even something as simple as what percentage of VO2 max can you sustain for a 100-mile race, which we know really well at the marathon distance, at Olympic distance triathlon,
Yeah,
Ironman triathlon.
yeah,
Like we can narrow that down pretty closely.
yeah.
The best estimates that we have at the 100-mile distance is anywhere between 30 and 70%, which is completely meaningless. Like it's like we've got to get it better than that. That's another whole.
And I guess it also depends on how you define it, because probably in those kind of races there are pauses, you know, and so what's peak speed, what's peak intensity, because then you're starting to talk about a duty cycle.
Yep.
Right.
There's
What's my work
stochastic
rest
nature. Yeah.
huh
There's a
yeah,
stochastic
there's
nature
kind
to
of
the
a work
intensity.
rest nature.
Yeah. 100%.
So yeah,
Okay.
there's lots of stuff to deal with.
Let's go back to our tools in the athlete's toolkit. So we've got the volume tool, you know, we need to maximize that. We've got the distribution of volume tool, and we know we need to concentrate the volume on certain sessions as opposed to peanut butter spreading it. We still have this, I feel like you're dodging the question like our politicians do daily. We still have this intensity question in terms of, from an ultra running perspective, they can choose to do an hour long tempo interval. They can choose to do 45-second intervals. They can choose to do 3-minute intervals and things like that. We know that we need to do different ones, right? Throughout the course of the year, I think everybody can kind of agree on that. We don't want to go out and do 2 days, 2 days out of the week, 1 hour tempo ad nauseum. That's, nobody's doing that anymore. But we do know that, or we should try to figure out from any sport perspective, particularly in ultra running, which types of these combinations of workouts might be more or less valuable. Can we say anything to that based on the literature and reasonable extensions of the literature?
Well, to be honest with you, the first answer I would have to you is, guys, it doesn't matter as much as you think it does.
Yeah.
Every time we start to go in and do any kind of real good meta-analysis on interval training, for example, then you end up with, it's a big soup. If you do the work, and so within the interval spectrum, I tend to tell people, if you're reasonably well trained, then I'm going to recommend to you that your hard sessions, where you're in that zone 3 area, should be in that 30 to 40 minute total accumulated duration, that you're going to collect minutes, or collect sounds easy, accumulate minutes. And the way you do that, the research suggests that it is not too important. It could be 2-minute intervals, it could be 4-minute bouts, 8-minute bouts, but you want to accumulate enough work at about somewhere around 90% of maximum heart rate. So it may start at 86, 7, and it may end up at 92 during the workout, and you're going to accumulate minutes. And if I'm the coach, I'm not going to have any problem with my athlete we kind of mix it up. Like my daughter, her running, she's a runner, her bread and butter workout is 4 or 5 times 8 minutes. 4 times 8, 32. 5 times 8, 40. And nowadays we basically say, you don't get to go above 90%. I want you, I don't want you in that highest intensity zone, because it's too costly, and you don't get the bang for your buck is not there. Yeah. So we tend to, and we've seen this in elite performers in cross-country skiing and rowing and running, that there seems to be, if you're talking about sweet spot, and I hate that term because it's so misused and so misunderstood, but if you're talking about attractors or typical places, that I'm going to say that 2 very reasonable intensity spots in a polarized model would be about 65%, 65%, and about 90%.
Yeah. One of the ways that I've always viewed this is, once you design a workout architecture such that it's going to eclipse that 90% mark, the goal of the workout should be to maximize the time that you're exposed to the intensity. And it's in a certain way, not that the difference between like 90 and 95% doesn't matter, but it's the volume of time matters more than the absolute amount of intensity. And so anyway, I just go back to when I'm looking at how to design workouts and things like that, I'm typically trying to favor the ones, as long as we can eclipse that 90% mark. I'm typically tending to favor ones that can maximize the time at exposure.
Yeah, and I think that's reasonable. And it's also about um, sustainability, which I know is a terrible, I
Right.
mean, it's a well-worn expression, but when I talk sustainability for training, I'm talking about the ability to come back day after day and do the training,
Well,
because then we're back to that consistency issue.
yep.
Consistency of being able to get up day after day and do the work. Well, if you do a heroic, epic interval session on Thursday, but it just kicks your butt, and you're not worth the crap for 2 days after that, well, then what do we get? What was the net gain?
Yeah.
Whereas if I have you back off just a little on that interval session and say, leave one in the tank,
Yeah.
or put a 90% governor on the engine, well, now I'm getting consistency. I'm coming back to that consistency idea, because you're able to get up the next day and do a run, not a hard run, but you're able to, keep the motor turning. You're keeping the stimuli happening. That's one of the most typical errors I see in athletes that are really, they double down on intensity and they say, man, if I can just gut out the hardest interval session ever, that's going to give me progress. And often it does not.
Yeah, and in terms of that exposure of time, maybe I should kind of clarify that. The lens that I'm looking through that is typically on the order of several weeks, not one session.
Yeah.
So if I can
Okay.
accumulate like 60 minutes of 60 minutes of time at above 90%, I would rather have an athlete be able to do 50 minutes or 45 minutes twice in a 10-day period versus one 60-minute session in a 10-day period, because the total amount of exposure for that period of time, that 10-day period of time, is greater. And I feel that drives a greater adaptive response.
Right. I think that is kind of a, what should I call it, a self-organizational principle that starts to emerge from elite athletes who train a lot. They start to understand this. And over decades, we've seen this. And I think this is why we see some of these intensity distribution patterns that I've reported, that it's not, um, it's based on long-term feedback of trying to find continuity, and the athletes figure this stuff out over time.
Right.
And so some of our absolute best performers in the world that we have data from, all-time great cross-country skier, all-time great rowers, this is very typical, is that they're accumulating minutes. They're not in a 5 intensity zone model. They're doing very little training in that 5th zone,
Right.
that highest zone. It's just almost not happening, except in races.
Right. Exactly.
And then it's there. It's still there.
Yeah, absolutely. And which is the crazy thing, right? Because we have this phrasing kind of stuck in our head of use it or lose it, that if you can't train at that intensity, you can't do that intensity in the race, right? And we find that is actually not the case, even at the highest of levels.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's not true. I'm sorry. I feel comfortable saying that after looking at this data for 30 years. It's not true.
Right.
In fact, it's a dangerous presumption, because it does tend to push young athletes down the wrong path, that they think that if they don't do these super hard sessions, they don't get progress. A story along those lines I was told by a cyclist related to a former Tour de France winner, Cadel Evans, who's an Australian. He's an Aussie And Cadell, he won the tour. I guess he's about 42 now. He's been retired some years, but Cadell, he won the tour. He's one of the greats. I mean, and at a time when he was on the pro team, these young cyclists were, they're at a camp, and training camps are very common in cycling, and they're going to do these intervals. But Evans is not doing the program. He's not doing these tough intervals like these young bucks are. And so they're like, what's up with this? Why? He's the best of the best, and he's not doing the hard session the way we're doing it. And so one of the youngsters had the audacity and the nerve to actually ask him. It was like, you, Pete, you ask him. And so eventually somebody said, okay, I'll ask him. And so Cadell, you're an all-time champion, but you're not doing these intervals like we are. Why not? And he says, well, mate, it's a long season, and I've got to be ready in July. We're in January. And so I'm pacing myself, and so he was at a point in his career where he understood the long-term process.
Yeah.
And I think that is, and he wasn't trying to, he wasn't turning every problem into something he was going to hammer with intensity.
Right. And we see that with a lot of athletes that have something to prove, right? That they tend to use these kind of more sexy approaches to training where they're using that intensity hammer a tremendous amount. Let's get into the weird sport of ultra running a lot now, because we know we know that the performance it's just a different proposition than we see even in stage race cycling, which tends to be who can make it over the first climb, and then who can make it over the second climb, and who can make it over the third climb, and then who's at the top of the Tourmalet or whatever. There's a totally different physiological proposition in those races versus this durability, which tends to be very low intensity, and how long can you sustain not having that intensity drop off. What types of, outside of trying to build a tremendous amount of volume, what can ultra runners look towards in order to be able to extend this concept of durability that is oh so important in the sport?
Well, let's think about it. Where does the attrition, where does the fatigue and the damage happen? One is at the muscular level, where you get literally muscular damage. And so an example of that is I have a colleague that was working down in Qatar at the Aspire Academy, and he was doing some ultra stuff, but in Qatar it's just flat as can be.
Right.
And so he does an ultra, and he doesn't do very well for his standards. And he says, he realizes, I need more eccentric loading. I need more downhill running. Where am I going to get that? Because there's no hills. And so he starts running up and down the stairs in high rises. And just that, he drops 30 minutes off his time the next race, and he's able to play tennis the next day with his kid after an ultra, just by bringing in the negative, the downhill running, because it just is clearly adaptive in a way that is extending. It's making him less susceptible to the damage and the attrition. So we know, obviously, I think strength training, I think pretty, some significant not only climbs, but downhills probably have an adaptive effect that make the legs more tolerant of and more resistant to the damage that's going to occur as the race wears on during an ultra run. Obviously, and I was at a presentation or a conference back in 2015, and I remember Mia, he's one of the guys that does good research on ultra athletes, and he was discussing this, that so far, we haven't maybe seen the best East African runners try ultra, but so far it looks like there's at least a little bit of a difference in the morphology of the best ultra runners, that they have a little bit more quadriceps muscle mass. They're not just necessarily thinner is better, and maybe that's to help spread the load of all, and he was looking at these athletes that do a lot of vertical meters, up and down. But something about it, there is research showing that strength training helps, eccentric loading helps, so I would have that part of it. I want to keep, just making that muscle as resilient as possible to the repetitious loading, because that's what's gradually going to beat down that athlete, and their stride shortens, and that for one reason, just because the muscle damage during the run. And then the other huge issue I think is fueling. It's gastrointestinal training, and that's not my research world, but you have to be able to get in food. You have to tolerate a fairly high consumption of calories, of carbohydrates for hours. You have to tolerate, your stomach has to tolerate, it's having to do a lot of work, which normally doesn't happen during endurance exercise. What happens, normally we're exercising and the brain basically shuts down blood flow to the so-called splanchnic region, which is just the intestines, so that it can be rechanneled to the muscle. The body makes decisions about blood flow distribution, short-term gain versus long-term needs, less kidney blood flow, less blood flow to the intestines, and so forth. And that works if you're running for an hour, right? But if you're running for 6 or 9 or 12, wait a minute, I gotta have some of both. I've got to have a functioning gastrointestinal system. This is where you start to see some athletes just handle it better than others, but it's trainable.
Right.
Learning how to eat, what to eat, what your eating cycle, your drinking cycle is. I think that if I were going to go into ultra distance, that is definitely one of the areas where I would become an expert, at least on myself. I would become and I think it is individual to a certain extent, of what do I tolerate, and how can I move a lot of carbohydrate through my body so that I keep fueling as long as possible. Because you're in fat burning modus, I get it, but you still need some carbs. You still need your blood glucose can't fall too low, and you need to be hydrated. You need to stay hydrated.
And we know that the nutritional components absolutely affect this durability concept, even at shorter durations, like the 3-hour duration, 4-hour duration earlier. You want to go through some of the things that you've done personally, and then also that you've kind of like crowdsourced through Twitter to demonstrate that?
Well, definitely one of the biggest problems, the biggest things that we see with athletes is they dehydrate. They don't ventilate well. If you're stuck indoors in cycling because of COVID and that, there's been a lot of indoor cycling and that. If you're rowers, they tend to sit on rowing machines, and rowers often are pretty big bodies and they produce a lot of heat. They have trouble getting rid of heat, so they sweat like crazy. You can imagine an Oxford rowing club where there's 15 95-kilo chunks of human, and they're sweating like crazy. Well, you can just imagine what a bad environment that is for keeping ventilated. So we've done some indoor studies where like 4-hour rides and versus two times 2, and clearly keeping the drinking schedule makes a difference. If you don't drink, heart rate drifts up. If you don't drink, you are contributing to the collapse of your system. And by collapse, I mean that you're slowly deteriorating functionally, because when you don't drink, you ultimately decrease blood volume. So your heart's having to go at a higher heart rate to do the same cardiac work. You're just debilitating the body's ability to sustain itself because of dehydration. So hydration matters. It helps prevent the decoupling, or it reduces the rate of decoupling, that heart rate drift. And let me tell you, people say, well, who cares if my heart rate's going up? It doesn't matter. Well, yes, it does, because it is a speedometer. In almost every case, when we look at heart rate, If your heart rate's high, you're stressed, right? If I'm sitting right here and I'm nervous and my heart rate's 110, then I'm not in as good a place as I would be if it was 70. And it's the same situation if you're out running and your heart rate has drifted up 15, 20 beats. It's not for nothing that has happened. It's because your body is more stressed to achieve the same workload. So that decoupling does tell us something. And one of the things that helps reduce the decoupling is just good hydration and good intake of, keeping the calories in as well. So partly it's the fluid, but partly some caloric intake as well.
Well, and you've even measured your heart rate during your TED talk. I remember going through that. So you're definitely stressed there, huh? Were you at threshold? I think that's what everybody wants to know is what lactate turn point were you at your highest point? During
I don't know if I had much lactate, but I sure as hell had a lot of cortisol pumping through my
veins. Okay, let's get into what you're studying in the lab, because we talked about this a little bit. It's either going to be on air or off air, depending upon where I decide to cut in. But you're doing some stuff at university that might be important for ultrarunners. Why don't you describe what that looks like right now?
Well, we've talked about the fact that the research literature is kind of overly weighted towards studies on interval training, right? High intensity, what's the magic, what's the flavor of the month on your interval prescription? And I've contributed to it a little bit. I've published some interval studies, so I'm guilty as well. But given that I've also published quite a bit of work on intensity distribution, and I've said repeatedly that the bread and butter for endurance athletes is that, that low intensity, those low, long sessions. Well, then we start getting into the question, how low is too low? How long is too long? We start asking questions about the prescription of those low intensity endurance sessions, right? And so that's what I'm trying to pursue now through some research, is to say, okay, how do intensity and duration interact in that low intensity range? And I do believe that that's the reason that when people say, Professor Seiler, what intensity should I be at for the low intensity sessions? Right. And then my answer is always, well, sir, it depends. Are you going to be there for an hour, 2 hours, or 4 hours? Right? Because 50% of VO2 max for 1 hour is probably not a sufficient stimuli, but 50% of VO2 max for 5 hours may be a heck of a stimuli, right? 70% of VO2 max is probably pretty darn hard for 3 hours, but if you're only going out an hour, then that may be appropriate. If it's still below threshold. So I think that's why you can't give a blanket answer on this question of what's a good prescription in the low intensity range. And particularly, I do think that there are these issues of saddle time or time on your feet that you need to consider. It's not just about developing mitochondria. It's also about adapting the muscles, the joints, the tendons to the repeated mechanical loads. So that's a big part of the training process for the ultra runner. And that's one of the reasons why I'm going to want them, if I'm the coach, I'm going to want to do those 4-hour slogs, 4-hour sessions where you may have some walking involved on the hills or whatever. I'm going to still want them to do that because that's good preparation for their race.
I've always thought that this how easy is too easy question is lazy on two fronts. First is the obvious one, right? You're trying to get to like the minimum amount of exertion that you can get away with. Yeah. But the second way that the question is lazy is because whenever you're talking about exercise prescription, you have to have both the volume and intensity components defined in order to ascertain the answer. So to your point of, sometimes an exposure of 50% at VO2 max is not worth it for an hour, but it might be worth it for 4 or 5 or 6 hours. Absolutely. So we need to remember that there are two sides to that coin in terms of what is best. There's the intensity side, but there's also how much time you're actually exposed at that. The intensity is absolutely important.
Well, or I would even go farther and I'd say any discussion of intensity is absolutely meaningless without a discussion of duration.
Yeah.
Because, you know, intensity is one dimensional, and it only takes on meaning physiologically when you start multiplying it times the duration. That's
100%.
why we have so-called pace or power duration curves.
100%. 100%. Okay. So this is the era of crowdsourcing a lot of, I was going to use the word research, but I think that might actually be the right word, which you've done a really cool job with. I mean, I've really appreciated what you've been able to do on Twitter, just in terms of galvanizing the endurance community to to find information about different training protocols, particularly indoors. What's next on that front for you? Like, what do you
Yeah.
got kind of like cooking in the back of your brain that we can bring out in this podcast and help you plug?
Oh, well, there's a delicate balance, and I think this is challenging academia and challenging research because of ethical issues, because of normally, for those who are not in my world, if we're going to design some laboratory study where we're going to have people come in, there's always these. Thankfully, since the end of World War II, there have been things called institutional review boards, which assess the degree to which any researcher is exposing other humans to unnecessary risk, risk of injury, risk of undue pain, all of these things. So every study on humans has to be evaluated by some review board. And this is part of our job, to make sure we've dotted the I's and crossed the T's, and we've got all of our security issues in place, whether it's COVID-19 related now and risk of infection, blood, all these different things. These studies, whether it's master's study or PhD program, all of them have to be done that way. Well, now with crowdsourcing, we've added some challenges, because if I recruit 50 people and they're between age 20 and let's say 50, then I'm having to, they're all over the world. And what happens if one of them gets sick or has a heart attack while they're doing the workout that was actually going to be Stephen's data? Am I at fault? Mm-hmm. Is my institution at fault? So I'm in kind of this, I have done some of this stuff, and I am in these discussions because we're all facing this. A lot of sports scientists are seeing tremendous possibilities in crowdsourced research, because we can do things that are practical. We can do things that have direct relevance to training practice. We can increase the sample size so that we get the variation. We start to be able to say things about that better than we can do with a sample of 10 people in a lab. Now I can have, 100 people that do something for me via Twitter, but we've got to just make sure that we find the right balance between the value and the quickness and the directness, the direct translation to practice through crowdsourcing, and then make sure that we don't get anybody hurt, that I as a scholar don't get moved too fast. And I've had a tendency to do that. I've just, because
you're enthusiastic about it.
Yeah. And I want to know the answer, and I want you guys I want to be able to help tell people the answer. So that's what I would share with people that are listening, is just that, yeah, I think crowdsourced research is a tool. I ask questions, but I've kind of done a lot of this recently without expecting to publish some of those things. Right. Because if I want to publish it, then I have to go that slow route through the institutional review board. In Norway, I may have to even go through a national review board. And so then I'm probably not, I'm going to slow down. I'm not going to do certain kinds of studies as crowdsourced, just because right now the institutional review boards don't know what to think about it.
Yeah.
So
the way that I've
but it's still a good tool.
The way that I've kind of looked at it, to your point of having a good tool, it's an enhanced way of evaluating anecdote, right? We have all of these athletes that are out there training in the field. If we can take that huge mass of athletes and give it some shape it a little bit and give it some direction, we can glean information from it. It might not be as precise as a research study, it might not be as well controlled as formal research and things like that, but we can still, at the end of the day, we can still glean information of it, just like we glean information. We have to carefully glean information from anecdote and from story and things like that. I've always viewed kind of what has transpired recently predominantly over Twitter, and you've been a really influential driver of this, as just another way that we can glean information from athletes that are actually doing things in the field. And to your point, it's really practical because it's
Yeah.
what they're actually doing. It's not an over contrived setting.
Yeah. So don't get me wrong. I'm going to use it. And I would even argue that there are different levels.
Yeah.
One level is just purely passive, where something like Strava or the concept to rowing ergometer, all the world rankings, there's just publicly accessible databases. Yeah. And that's just, the person has basically said, this is free game because I put my data out there. Well, that's not too problematic at all, even for the institutional review boards. And then the next level up that I've gone to has been to do things like questionnaires. I can get 1,000 responses on a questionnaire in 3 days, 2 days on Twitter. That gives me some interesting perspective on how people think, how people use, what's typical practice. And that's low risk. That's not hurting anybody. That's, and then we move into that next level, which is to have people, if I say to them, like I did last March, April, I say, hey, you're stuck inside anyway, you're on the bike, why don't we agree on a little bit of protocol here? You're going to do a 4-hour ride, and so we did that kind of study where I just had them do something they were going to do anyway, but we kind of controlled the parameters, used Google Forms, used some bespoke software we created, and it worked great. But it wasn't a training intervention. It was just saying, what are the responses? How dehydrated are you getting? How much is your heart rate drifting, and things like that. And that gives some answers that are useful in training. But then the next level that we're starting to see, and that I have a couple of PhD people that I'm interacting with in different countries, that they are going full blown. They are organizing intervention studies, training interventions. And one is using Trainer Road. They have a cooperation with Trainer Road, an application there that is helping them to recruit athletes into this randomized trial where they're going to be training in different, using different training methodologies. So that is, and we're talking, the goal there is maybe 200, 300 subjects. Yeah. That's huge.
Yeah, that's big.
To do a training study, because that's never been done in we've never had that many well-trained people doing a training intervention in a lab-based study. You just can't do it. I've come pretty, the best I've managed is do a multi-center trial with 3 different locations, and we had about 70. Yeah. And that was rock and roll. That was big. Yeah. And that was hard. Yeah. But this approach with digital data and all that, I do think it's part of the future toolbox, and you're going to see publications that are going to use this. And this pandemic the only thing it's done is accelerate that development.
Yep. Well, I'll tell you what, you want to do it on Ultrarunners, we're pretty game for torturing ourselves. So if you want to come up with some sort of protocol, throw it out there. You'll have 1,000 responses. I guarantee you, I'll be more than willing to help you out with that.
Actually, you better be careful there, because that's an interesting idea.
I will. I'm serious.
I have the software to play with that issue. So I work with, we'll have to talk off camera or off mic.
Yeah, for sure. And I'd love to do that. I always put my money where my mouth is, trying to support research and get people involved in it, because there's a gap when we go up to the ultra distances. In fact, I had to look this up just the other day. When I first started working with Ultrarunners that year, there were a total of 6 papers that were published in that domain. 6. That's nothing. So
Well, and
it's come a long way.
I've looked a little bit at the data. You have a guy named Beat Knechtel from Switzerland, or Beat or Beat. I'm not sure how he pronounces his own first name. He's done a tremendous amount of stuff, but very much of it is based on big data, looking at databases, looking at correlations between different test results and performance. And you can glean some information from that. For example, you can find out that, well, it helps to have a low BMI, meaning you're lean and don't weigh very much. That's one of the best predictors of success, but that doesn't help us very far. So to move beyond just the kind of the superficial characteristic stuff and into some details about the training process, I do think it's going to take some kind of, it'll probably take a crowdsourced approach, because you can't do you can't do 4-hour runs in the lab. So, but if I can cooperate with someone like your athletes, and we can say, all right, let's agree on that over the next 3 or 4 or 2 months, you're going to run 3 different long runs, that last 2, 4, and 6 hours. And we're going to look at, in that in duration range, how is intensity changing? Now that would be an interesting question, and that's just the first thing I think of, is just moving out to that range that is more relevant for your athletes than for typical 10K runners, right?
You get people to participate in that 100% because we're doing it anyway, and we want to know the information. I have no doubt about that. Maybe between the time that we record this and the time this comes out, we can brainstorm a little bit, and I can put it in the show notes or in the outro. But if not, people will just have to hound us once the podcast comes out. What are we going to do?
Then we get into this is where I get ahead of myself, because my brain is like going fast. But then immediately the other part of my brain, which is tied to an academic institution, says, well, this is good enough. This should be published, which means I need to go through IRB. I need to go through the review board process so that all my I's and T's are crossing. So I've got this, like, there's fast Stephen and logical slow Stephen, and they're competing with each other all the time.
I'm so glad we got to peer into your inner psyche, because as
my
somebody,
inner schizophrenia.
Well, I could tell you this, Stephen, as somebody who's followed your work for well over a decade. I don't even want to go back that far because that'll date both of us. well over a decade, and used a tremendous amount of it in practice. I'm very appreciative of it. I know we kind of made fun of all the different contrived iterations of what that research has actually looked like, but it's appreciative because I can prescribe something and have a reasonable degree of certainty of what the outcome or what the physiological outcomes of it is going to be. And it's because of all of that nuance. And it might not be all that different between this prescription and that prescription, but at least I know. It's made a big impact on me. And I can tell you, across our entire coaching group, we have 50 coaches across our coaching group. That type of research has made a big impact across the board: running, ultra running, triathlon, cycling, you name it, in the endurance disciplines. It goes without stated. And I'm just thrilled to get into your inner psyche just a little bit at the very end of this podcast. So I'm very appreciative of it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It makes it meaningful to do the work when I know people are actually able to use it.
Yeah, and it is, absolutely. All right, Steve, we're going to let you go. Any final words that you have, or any places that we can direct athletes to find a little bit more about what you do?
Well, I, like you said, I'm kind of all over the place just because there has been some demand, but I do have this Twitter account, which is just my name. And then I actually have a YouTube channel, which is kind of scary to say. My son,
it's awesome, by the way. It's awesome.
My son would disagree. He would say, well, you are such a you're such a meaningless YouTuber, Dad, because you don't even have anywhere close to 1 million followers. So,
it's information. It's information heavy. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. So for my little niche, I think maybe there are some people that could benefit. So yeah, I try to put out some stuff on training there on YouTube, and then there's a continuous dialogue going on Twitter. So.
Yep. You're an awesome Twitter follow. Like I said, I really appreciate your work. Thanks for coming on the podcast today. And we will sync up offline and try to come up with some sort of crowdsourced project one way or another.
That'd be great. Awesome. All right.
And there you have it. There you go. Much thanks to Steve for coming on the podcast today. As I mentioned from the onset, you've not only had a tremendous impact on me, but also the endurance community as a whole. We are all very appreciative for the knowledge base that you have provided to both coaches and athletes. And I promise everybody, we're going to get something crowdsourced on Twitter in terms of getting some research out there for the ultra endurance community. So go and give Steve a follow on Twitter. His handle is in the show notes. He's always a good follow for a ton of knowledge across the entire endurance spectrum. Thank you to all the listeners. Appreciate the heck out of each and every one of you. That is it for today. We will see you out on the trails.